Do you remember this quilt? I did a lessons from an old quilt on this, but if you didn't see it, that's okay. I'll put a link at the end. And I'll also tell you a few things about this amazing quilt. This quilt was purchased at an auction for $2. Yes, you heard that right, for $2. And inside of this old, very tattered, very messy, very stinky quilt, there is another quilt. Do you see it? Oh my goodness. So in this video, I'm going to tear this apart and show you every step of the way in case you have a situation like this where you have a very old, tattered, destroyed quilt that you need to tear apart. Let's get started with a seam ripper and delicately tear this thing apart. So I start by taking the binding off, and the stitches are really small in some places and really big in others. It was kind of surprising to me. So sometimes I could even pull it a little and it would come undone, but other times I had to take that seam ripper and painstakingly go into each and every little tiny stitch to get it out. By far the hardest part of tearing apart this quilt was getting out those quilting stitches. They were tiny, and I painstakingly went in with a seam ripper trying to get underneath them. Unfortunately, sometimes the fabrics were just so dry and disintegrated that the threads were actually cutting the fabrics. I'm not sure exactly what the tension setting or what was going on in the maker's mind, because it is teeny tiny, tiny, tight stitches. So this whole process is extremely messy, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep pulling it apart. It's taking hours upon hours. So I'm not going to show you the entire video of tearing this apart because, well, it would bore you to tears probably. So I'm going to continue taking it apart as slowly as possible to preserve as much as possible. And I'll be back to show you the big reveal as we keep tearing this apart. I started off by cutting away the batting, and you'll find out why I stopped that in a bit here, because it probably wasn't the best decision for a couple of reasons. It did give me more clarity on where I was at in taking this quilt apart, but overall it wasn't the best decision. I started to notice there were ties in the middle layer and the bottom layer, so I was clipping them at first too, but again, I changed my strategy a little bit as time went on. Something really cool happened, and I had to interrupt the deconstruction of this just to explain to you. As I was tearing it apart, I noticed that we had this weird fabric or batting in it, and I could not figure out what it was. And it kind of concerned me that maybe it was something dangerous like asbestos or something like that. Possibly the batting was an old blanket that was maybe a fire-resistant blanket or something like that. So it concerned me. It's not common that that happens. It's actually very rare, but it still can happen, and it's absolutely something you should be concerned about with any old pot holders or anything like that that you'd find at estate sales. It could have asbestos inside. So I panicked and I stopped. My husband took a piece of this out to the yard and set it on fire to see, you know, what it would do, and it did disintegrate into ash. So we do know or believe that it is a cotton batting. So I kept going. I kept tearing it apart, figuring I was pretty safe, which I think I was. However, once I got a big chunk out, I realized it's a third quilt. This batting is another quilt. So, okay, so we got the base quilt, which is the churn dash. We have the next quilt, which I believe is a 9-patch. And then we have a third quilt that's a pinwheel type of block. Look at this. Now, I probably cannot save any of this, but how cool is that? So the maker, or makers probably, had a quilt, used it as batting in the second quilt, and then used that quilt as batting in the third. Who knows how old this quilt is and how many stories it could tell. Happy accident, turned out well. I'm glad it wasn't anything dangerous, and I'm gonna keep on tearing it apart. So let's go. I started off trying to save the top quilt. I really loved it, and I thought, oh, this will be great. So I was trimming away some of this third quilt that's under here now, and I started to quickly realize that the quilt that I want to put the priority in saving is actually this one, the one that's underneath. It's tied to the third quilt that's underneath that. Originally, I was taking out the ties and trying to get all three separate, and I've decided to change strategy and work on saving that second layer. One of the reasons that I did that is because this top layer is so dry rotted, and the stitches that were used for quilting this to the second and third quilt are so tiny that it's cutting the fabrics. Now, I'm not saying I'm not going to try to save the churn dash. I am, but my priority is going to switch to this one because I think this is the one that I really want to preserve the most if I have to choose. Of course, I'm going to try to save them all. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, tearing this apart. Hopefully, in the next segment, you'll see at least 2 of the pieces apart. So this is quilt number 1. This is what we could see when my dad bought this. You could see the whole thing. And it's in rough shape. I will try to save as much of this as I possibly can, but it's so cool to have it separate. And this is the second quilt. Look at that. Oh my goodness. Okay, so cool. The back is an absolute disaster. What I realized was the back of the entire thing was the original quilt. So when they put another quilt on top, they just kept adding to the top and pulling it around to the back, which is making more sense to me now as I tear this apart. I am going to take this apart now and show you the absolute original base of this, which I probably can't say, but it's still cool to see. And I took off the third layer, and here it is. This is the original bottom quilt. It's in rough shape, but here it is. This would be the first quilt that was made. The second one is the 9 patch. That's right here. And then the third is the churn dash. Isn't this cool? I mean, just to see the layers and layers of history. And the dating of these to figure out when they're from is really tricky. At least I found it tricky as I was doing some research on it. I believe that the first quilt, the bottom layer, is from around 1860, judging by the fabric, the techniques, all of that wonderful stuff. The second one, I'm dating around 1900 to 1910. Then the third layer is really tricky, because some of these fabrics are very, very old, at least from what I can tell. So I don't know what happened there. I don't know if the blocks were made and then put together later, because the setting fabric, which is that pink, when I started taking it apart and seeing the original color, it's this bubblegum pink, which we saw in like the 1930s, 1940s. So I'm thinking that's when it's from, but I also think the maker used either old blocks or old fabric to make this top one. So as for preservation of these quilts, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet. The top 2 I will wash by hand when the weather gets a little nicer, when I can hang it out and see if I can get some of those stains out. At that point, I'll assess and see what I can do with these. The third layer, that first layer, unfortunately, is just disintegrating as you touch it. I don't think there's much I can do with it. I may frame a portion of it in a shadow box or something like that. I'm just not sure what else to do, because it's flying all over my sewing room. It's everywhere. We can't stop sneezing either. I would try to repair these now, but honestly, they are so filthy. Who knows? Can you imagine the years and years of whatever is in these quilts? I don't even want to think about it. It would gross me out too much. Thank you so much for watching and enjoying this process with me. It's so much fun tearing apart these quilts and seeing what's inside when I can. Of course, I always try to preserve the quilts as is, but in this case, it needed to be taken apart. If you haven't seen it yet, go back and see the lessons from an old quilt. You may understand that more and my decision for that more after that. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you take some time to sew, and I'll see you real soon. Bye.